After viewing the full lesson, here are some key takeaways that came up during the lesson or during the press pause moment. We want to focus on teacher moves throughout the lesson. So at this point, you as a teacher should be familiar with the content and curriculum after having taught it at least once. So now we want to really push towards creating student discourse through planning and also during the facilitation of the lesson. So here are some key ideas to take away from this lesson. So make sure to overview the learning targets and agenda with your students. And remember, there's no need to go over every problem. So know what the outcome of the warm-up or the activity is and move on once you've met your goal or you've reached the outcome. And keep the warm-up short. That's not where all the learning should take place. And if you know enough of the students have gotten to a certain place in an activity that you can go ahead and facilitate the conversation, it is okay if not everyone has answered every question. Using partners allows students to see different approaches to the same problem. So it gives the students individual think time and then also sharing their thoughts with someone else to get a different perspective. Know when to cut off good conversations. And be upfront with your students that you may cut them off. Might be a good idea to go ahead and come up with a parking lot in your classroom in case students have additional questions that you weren't able to address within an activity. Make sure there's equity of voice within the classroom. At one point within the lesson, you saw that some of the same individuals kept answering questions, and the teacher in this particular lesson started randomly calling on students from different table numbers. So you could use different table numbers. She also at some point asked for let's show of hands. And when somebody started to talk and share an answer, she at one point cut them off and said, let's hear from someone else. So these are all some strategies that you can use to ensure everyone has a voice within the classroom. And just the use of partners and sharing, everyone is at least getting to hear at least from one other person, if not more. Creating a space where mistakes are okay is extremely important. Some of the phrases that we heard throughout the lesson from this teacher was, it's okay if you didn't get it right, it's new. And that was at the very beginning of the lesson when the content was new. And as we're working through the function notation and given a response, one of the questions that was said was, how could we improve this to make it more correct? Another phrase, this is not incorrect. I wanted to revise it using function notation. So we're still giving validity to the original response and adding to it to make it more correct. And while this teacher was monitoring students working, she always asked students if they would be willing to share what she heard them say when they came back to the whole group. Instead of cold calling, at least this gives the individual the opportunity to know and be prepared that they're going to share out within the bigger space. Some intentional teacher moves, and these are not the only things, but a few things to point out. The use of a timer. So just setting a timer within an activity or a warm-up, or using a timer for chunking different parts of the activity. Stating where there was just independent think time and being clear that there should not be conversation at that time. And then using the turn and talk or a shoulder partner. So once they've had that individual think time, then they have the opportunity to share their thoughts with a partner. During one of the lesson debriefs, She focused on writing as well as talking about the thinking, because sometimes when we write down something, it doesn't always come out in writing how we intended that or what we were actually thinking. So to be precise about that. Also writing in complete sentences or complete thoughts. Throughout the lesson, the teacher referenced previous learning, whether it would have been from a previous lesson or something that had occurred earlier within the actual lesson. Counting down to regroup, so that gave students an indication of when they had to bring it back to a whole group. And there were certain times where she refocused the whole group even after the counting to make sure that when the discussion was taking place, that everyone was focused in on what the discussion was. And throughout the lesson, strategic monitoring and looking at and listening for keywords and vocabulary that students were using, and monitoring for who needed help or who would be willing to share. You need to know what you're actually looking for when you are monitoring. Something that was pointed out was make the slide decks your own. These can be copied and edited. You can add in additional questions. You can remove some of the questions if you wanted to make the questions your own, especially for the purpose of discussion. But make sure that you are comfortable with the slide deck and you know what is in the slide deck prior to using it within the lesson. Also, deciding during planning what needs to be written on the board and stay throughout the lesson versus something that can be left up on a board for 1 or 2 minutes, for example, and maybe a notice and wonder, where there was something within this lesson with a function notation that was kept up on the board for the entirety of the lesson once the function notation had been shared. You make sure to use the responsive strategies as needed based on your students. They might not be necessary for all your students, but you should know your students, and in this case, yellow cards were given out with sentence starters for students that the teacher saw might need that support. But those responsive strategies are in the purple boxes throughout the teacher material. The teacher also captured and displayed the student work. You can do this in your classroom using Pear Deck or any other medium. You could have them just share their pictures. You could use a document camera. So whatever resources you have to make it easier for your display. And then you could have that student talk about their work. You could have another student talk about the work. Or in this case, it was comparing what was alike and what was different about the 2 work samples that were being displayed. And again, so you could, and one thing that was used throughout the lesson is having students restate what another student had said. And this puts that back on the student as opposed to the teacher just repeating what was said. This is, did the student actually understand what another classmate or peer said? Something that was pointed out were the differences between 2 of our instructional routines. The critique, correct, and clarify versus the stronger and clearer. In the critique, correct, and clarify, the first draft is always given to the students, and it usually occurs early on in the unit because the students are not well versed in that content yet. Where the stronger and clearer is when the students write the first draft and then make that clearer as they move along. And this appears later in the unit because the students have more exposure to the content. And lastly, look at the cool down. What would the student need to know to demonstrate understanding on the cool down? And have what the decisions you've made gotten those students to the point where they can understand and answer the cool down effectively. and met the target. So after reviewing this lesson, as you move forward in your instruction, want to focus on intentional teacher moves to create a learning environment that is a safe space for mistakes and encourages student discourse. This puts the heavy lifting on the student as opposed to the teacher with that upfront planning and just-in-time redirection within the lesson to meet the student needs.